Canada's Online Harms Act, using good intentions as a way to infringe on free speech. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government has recently made the headlines due to the introduction of Bill C-63, or the Online Harms Act, which is the third act of Trudeau's government's attempts to regulate the Internet. The first two acts were the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act, both of which were attempts to assist traditional media companies survive online at the expense of regulating social media platforms. This third act is an attempt to regulate speech online that is posted by social media users. This bill, which is still in Parliament, is an example of the government using legitimate online issues and making them a gateway into enacting new requirements that will increase the power of the government and will further erode freedoms of Canadian citizens. The bill is promoted to enact regulation on social media companies that require them to remove illegal content, such as child pornography, from their platforms within 24 hours of being notified of the illegal activity. Presented in this way, the bill has near unanimous support, as it seems like a reasonable protection to extend to children who cannot consent to such illegal and immoral acts. This makes the bill one of those feel-good bills, and when the headline is protecting children from illegal and predatory activities. It would be a good bill if it stopped there, but like so many other government regulations, it is underneath the headline and then the small print that makes this good bill turn into a gateway into broad-based assaults on free speech and expression in Canada. The bill proposes requiring the new content moderation, new regulators to enforce content moderation, and that these new regulators will determine who has access to the social media data, new administrative policies for non-compliance of the social media companies, and cost charges social media companies must pay for the new regulators and their infrastructure. The bill also amends the Criminal Code of Canada for individuals who violate the new content moderation as determined by the new regulators under the newly created Digital Safety Ombudsman, who acts in similar capacity and power to the various provincial human rights commissioners. The requirements stated in the bill seems overly complicated to enforce removing such things as child pornography, which is already illegal in Canada, so there seems to be no need to require additional updates to the criminal code. So there seems to be a bigger agenda beyond the headline. Once the details of the bill are laid out for all to read, then the red flags of the bill become apparent, and it appears the bill is designed to chill free speech and not just to protect children. The requirement of the social media companies to take down objectionable content is not just limited to child pornography. It requires media companies to mitigate risks to users, label automated communications, find and label harmful content, preserve content that has been removed from the site, and remove content that incites violence, extremism, and terrorism. The government regulators will be given authority to determine this content, but it is not explicitly spelled out in the law. If the social media companies fail to properly implement the requirements of the law, they can be fined up to 6% of their global revenue. Social media companies that are liable for can be argued as subjective standards of extremism or incitement, both of which can be easily interpreted by subjective individuals in a currently highly charged political environment, that puts a high burden on social media companies with the threat of extreme and crippling fines per violation. Social media companies will need to evaluate their risk and determine if they have the technical ability to support the proposed law. The companies must determine the regulatory environment as well, as the new government bureaucracy will be subjected to political winds of whatever political party holds power in government. The result is that the social media companies will err on the side of caution and heavily self-censor to mitigate their risk. For example, would they block any user that mentions the Freedom Convoy legal battles, but will allow Trudeau's government's gun control measures to be displayed prominently on their sites to stay in the good graces of a government that is more than willing to use the power of the state to enact their agenda and suppress opposition? The platforms will become purveyors of government positions on all topics. The act does not limit itself to social media corporations, but will pursue action against individuals who post government objectionable content with updates to the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act. Penalties for offenses to the Criminal Code for hate violations will be increased from a maximum of 5 years to a maximum of life in prison, and the promotion of genocide also goes from 5 years to life for the maximum sentence, for examples, as the most egregious penalty charges. An example of the danger of this part of the bill can be found in the protests in Canada between the supporters of Israel and Palestine, both of which sides are accusing the other of genocide. It does not take any deep imagination to determine how this law has the potential for abuse. Hate speech online will be added a new discriminatory practice and will allow provincial human rights commissions to act against individuals who post what their government determines as hate. Most disturbingly, the bill of terribleness, the bill adds that it can be described as thought crimes. The bill will allow for the arrest, fine, and imprisonment of any individual that the government believes may commit hate crimes or distribute hate propaganda. No actual crime or utterance needs to occur to be charged under this provision. Also, since the individual has not actually committed a hate crime or distributed hate propaganda, there is no way for a person to defend themselves since they have not actually physically committed or threatened to commit a crime. It is uncertain how the government will determine this, but they may target opponents of the government, or they can monitor whom an individual associates with in person or online. So, if a user follows and occasionally comments with another user, and that user gets charged under this new Canadian online hate speech law, will the one who follows and comments be charged for the association? Not only is freedom of speech at risk, so is the freedom of association. This law is meant to curtail social media companies, who are often not the easiest companies to sympathize with, and their users. The onerous requirements based on these both objective and subjective measures under the threat of crippling penalties will force social media platforms to heavily censor users or restrict access to the platform. Individual users are also threatened by newly overly punitive penalties that has a new oversight regime and lower burdens of proof. Users are also threatened by being charged with thought crimes based on subjective measures of a regulatory or by association. Users most likely will self-censor or will leave the platforms. The result for both platforms and users is that there will be less speech as certain subjectively determined speech is punished. Americans need to closely watch this Canadian experiment and contest any attempts to water down the First Amendment so that members of Congress do not attempt to bring such regulation and legislation to the United States.